Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you can hear me. My name is Ayanna Jackson, and I am with the American Advertising Federation. I am the VP of the Mosaic Center, which houses all of the AAF's D&I initiatives. I want to thank you all for attending today's panel, and I would like to give a special shout out to our host, who's hosting in conjunction with us, AdColor. I know some of you are here in the audience. Today's topic is going to be on AI and the diversity dichotomy, and our panelists are going to explore the existing biases within artificial intelligence, and hopefully we'll be able to also explore some of the paths to inclusion. And so I am not going to spend too much time up here because we have a lot of content to cover, and I know our panelists are eager to get started. So I am going to throw it over to our moderator, Amira Cisse with Sparks and Honey.
Yes, that's me. So I hope everyone's excited to talk about AI. It's a super buzzy topic, as we all know, but I think today we have the opportunity to explore a sort of underappreciated part of it, which is inclusion and what it means for it. So before we get into it, I just wanted to, again, echo the gratitude that Ayanna just expressed, firstly for AdColor, but also the American Advertising Federation. As always, they are partly responsible for bringing together this meeting of the minds, so thanks again, guys. And before we sort of hop into things, just as a setup, this is definitely a topic that I and my organization are really excited to explore. I think oftentimes when I think about AI, I think about that adage about, to err is human and to forgive is divine. So, if to err is human, what can we consider about the misgivings around AI? So that's sort of a guiding post for me, but I'm excited to hear from our cast. If you guys could take a moment, maybe 30 seconds, to just top line tell us who you are and what you're bringing to this discussion, that'd be awesome.
So my name is John Rich. I'm the VP of FutureX Labs based in Atlanta. And what we do is we look at emerging technologies that we think are going to have the biggest impact on the world in the next 2 to 5 years. We bring those technologies into the lab and we build prototypes with them. And obviously, artificial intelligence is probably the most powerful technology, and it's one we're using the most.
Awesome.
My name is Charlton Mcelwain. I'm a professor of media, culture, and communication at New York University. And my perspective here is really as a historian, which is the hat I've been wearing for the last 3 years, researching and writing a new book called Black Software, which chronicles the relationship between African Americans and computing since 1960s up through the present. And so much of what I'll talk about today is sort of where we've been and how that influences where we are and where we're headed.
My name is Pavani Yalla. I am creative director at Second Story, which is a experience design studio within Sapient Razorfish. And we focus on building interactive, immersive experiences within the physical environment. And so while we're not in the business of artificial intelligence, we are implementing systems and building applications that leverage it, and thinking about this topic a lot. I also lead up a lot of our diversity and inclusion efforts within our teams, so have a perspective from that side of things as well.
I'm Joe O, President and CEO of FCB West. I think within this panel, I represent sort of the big brand, culture, and sort of the big business point of view within this discussion. I'm nowhere near smart or academically inclined as these folks are, so I bring the perspective of business and the application of AI and diversity of inclusion into sort of the business world.
Awesome. Well, don't sell yourself short, Joe. In fact, we really want to hear from all sorts of people. And I guess, firstly, it might be important for us to level set just for the benefit of our audience, because this is not something that I think everyone talks about. So does anyone have on hand perhaps a really concise and accessible definition to share with all of us around what artificial intelligence is, the nuts and bolts that can just get us all on the same page?
Yeah, so what I was hoping to do is just take us through a few slides that maybe will help frame that up. And so This is a quote by a well-known AI researcher, and I think it has both some optimism in it and maybe some a little bit of a dark side too. Nick Bostrom has said that this is the last technology that humans will ever need to make because it is that powerful. I think the other way to think about it is it could be the last technology we get to make, depending on how we treat it, how fast it advances, and how much we align it with our goals and our values. So, and when we talk about artificial intelligence, it is very confusing often because it's many things. There are different techniques like convolutional neural networks. There are many goals like natural language processing or image recognition. And then when we move machine intelligence into physical forms, you end up with things like surgical robots or maybe even domestic robots or autonomous cars. So this is a technology that will literally transform everything moving forward. I like this quote in terms of simplifying what is artificial intelligence. It really is just intelligence. It's the ability to solve complex problems. And just to reflect upon the idea about how important this technology is to us and our future, we are not the biggest animal on this planet. We're not the fastest, we're not the strongest, we definitely don't have the sharpest claws or the longest teeth, but yet we dominate, and it is because of our intelligence. And now, for the first time ever, we've created intelligence that is approaching human level. And so this is something we really need to focus on, in my opinion. And the things we're talking about are not some far-off science fiction future. Artificial intelligence is already better than us at a number of things. We know about Go, we know about diagnosing medical images. For any of you who have any investments, as we speak right now, probably the majority of your investments are being traded by artificial intelligence on the markets. So we often don't realize it, but AI is already around us, and it's doing a lot of things in our lives. And it's having some negative effects already, and that's what I think we're going to really talk about today is there's a number of lawsuits right now against Facebook because of people were able to not show ads to someone who is too old, which I have a personal issue with, or someone who was in the wrong zip code. So who even sees a job could be affected by these algorithms. Also, who gets a loan? Already all the banks are using algorithms to determine your creditworthiness, and that could have a huge impact on your lives. And then also things like who gets parole? Who's most likely to commit a crime in the future? And that's been shown, I think Charlton's going to talk maybe a little bit more about that, but that's been shown that there's been bias in those systems. So this is a real issue. And the last thing I just wanted to say before we get into the next part of the discussion is we are biased creatures, and this is our creation. This code, this data sets we create, so it's not surprising that some of the systems we've created are also biased. But what is really interesting is there's been a recent paper published just last September where researchers created a model using algorithms, and the algorithms on their own in many instances ended up being biased. They were randomly given group identities, group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, and their goal was to donate and trade. And over time, many of these groups, for no rational reason, began to only engage with their group. So it's interesting to see that much like how we've evolved, it seems like the AI systems can, even on their own, begin to move towards an issue around prejudice or bias. So that's something we have to think about moving forward.
Thanks, John. And I want to really kind of move the conversation backwards and sort of remind us, and it was a sobering moment for me starting into this conversation around AI, around computing technology 5 or 6 years ago, and trying to find my way back and learning, surprisingly, that this wasn't our first conversation, that we've had this conversation before, that it didn't begin 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but more than 50 years ago. And it started this way. And John brought up the idea about a problem and computational machines attaching themselves and really being driven by problems, AI being able to solve particular problems. And so back in the early 1960s, 64 precisely, who was America's greatest problem? It was African Americans who were in the streets, uprising, rioting. And so in a very real way, the President of the United States, the Attorney General said, and this all began with a question. And the question they asked was, how can we use new computational tools to address this problem, to tame folks that are out in the streets threatening the current racial, social, moral, political order? The answer that we came up with, a group of technologists, government folks, academics, and so forth, was what you see on the screen here. It was called Alert 2, piloted in 64, perfected and rolled out in 68, and among a number of things that it did, it used predictive algorithms that targeted, surveilled, and policed primarily African American communities. In Kansas City in particular, but this particular model was then rolled out to hundreds of similar systems that were in place across the United States by the mid-1970s. And so what I really want to point out here is we talk often about technology, we talk about AI, we talk about algorithms, but when we're talking about bias and how these two things together, we're really talking about a human problem. This problem began with folks who looked around and saw people that they saw as threats, right? And that became part of their own mindset. And then going to build systems and tools to solve that problem, you had that conjunction of what we might talk about as bias in AI. And I'll just bring us back current to the last few weeks. This came out in The Intercept about IBM using NYPD surveillance footage to develop technology that would allow people to essentially search by race, by skin color. And so a fully automated AI-driven system that really I see as the fulfillment of a 50-year enterprise. And so it's sobering me to think that over 50 years, we're still here. And that the same motivation driving how we use technology is the same as it was 50 years ago. And that, for me, is the essence of the problem, the challenge that we face today and moving up to the future.
So that's really sobering. In the research that I've done, and it hasn't been as long as you, Charlton, I think there's this whole other side of it too, that as scary as that sounds, it's to me even scarier, which is the fact that people are perpetrating bias and don't even know it, or harbor biases and don't even know it. And now we hear these terms: implicit bias, unconscious bias, and there are many examples of that. I feel like this is one example that is much more explicit, and it's like you can't even argue, right, that there is bias there and that it is detrimental. But if you think about some of the things that we're interacting with every day, I mean, how many of you have an Alexa or Google Home or have interacted with one before? As recently as yesterday, my mom's visiting now and taking care of my toddler while I'm traveling. She was trying to talk to Alexa, and my mom has a degree in English literature, speaks fluent English, could not get Alexa to understand a word she was saying. So it was a really frustrating interaction that they were having. And, that's frankly because Alexa and many of these bots are not trained on data sets that include a diverse group of people, right? And so natural language processing is that becomes an issue with that. And you could take something like that that's maybe a daily occurrence and maybe an annoyance for a certain population of people, and maybe just shove it aside and say it's something that's just a mild annoyance. But if you flip that same scenario and now imagine that Alexa is now an emergency management system, that is trying to understand a problem that my mom has and in the moment needs to help her solve that problem or get her help, that becomes potentially a much more tragic story. And so what I've been really interested in is thinking about how we've normalized, maybe unconsciously, or tolerated these things for a while. I mean, I can sit up here and whine about autocorrect getting my name wrong for decades, right? My name is Pavani, but paving is my autocorrect name. I'm sure many of you who don't have Western names have another name. And I can whine about that, but it also kind of feels silly. But again, these are behaviors that we have tolerated and just kind of dealt with and not really thought twice about. And I think that that's really dangerous because then we become vulnerable to the more really dangerous and threatening implications. And so that's something I'm really interested in, is looking at both the really explicit forms as well as the maybe more implicit and kind of hidden layers of bias that exist within these systems.
Love it. You guys are really throwing down the gauntlet. Bring it home, Joe.
Okay. Yeah, so I think, when you think about sort of the arc of the story we just walked through right now, I think the big question is who are the people asking the questions, right? If technology is a solution to a question, who are the people asking the questions, right? Who are the people who are answering the questions, and who are the people who are actually working in the systems, right? Because if bias is implicit, if bias is built in, then inclusion is the only way that we are going to change the conversation to either eliminate bias or diminish bias, right? Because you have perspective brought in, right? Because you have perspective brought in not only asking the question, but in the answering of the question, right? And within that, the question becomes, who do we trust to ask the questions, right? I mean, in this example specifically, it's government. Government was asking a very specific question, and within this, it states IBM, right? But business has answered the question, right, within this as a contractor. And so for us, therein lies a lot of this, which is sort of who gets the right to ask the question and who gets the right to use the technology and be a part of the dialogue to then solve for the problem. And by the way, is it even a problem, right? I mean, in this case, it was a problem that was being asked to be solved, but was it a problem, right? So a big part of what we're looking for in terms of in the business world is the question of, can we trust the technologies that are being built, right, for the money that we're spending to apply to our brands, those things, right? Can we trust, because there's skepticism now. We report things like this. While there are some who view the lens of technology with optimism, and some who view it with pessimism, right? Business views it with skepticism. We view it with skepticism because we don't know who's making it. And I think, Charlton, you spoke before about sort of the black box. No, John, I believe. John, you did. You spoke about the black box theory, right? And I think it's important for us to understand sort of what is in that, within the black box theory, right? Because that's inherent within all of this. That is the inherent problem that we have is sort of what's within that black box.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about a possible solution, but it is that black box that is a real issue around the case of artificial intelligence. Why did that person get picked to not be given parole? Why were you picked to get that loan? If we can't see how those decisions are being made and who's making them and what data is being pulled from where, then we don't know if it is fair or inclusive. And so that is one of the biggest issues right now, and I think we'll talk in a little bit about some paths forward and some maybe positive things that are happening.
Yeah, I'll just sort of chime in there and say, there's a a certain sense in which that scenario from 50 years ago was preferable to what we have today. That is, it was all laid out. It's in an archive. You can read the algorithms. You know who built it. You know what the mindset was. You know what the problem they were trying to solve and the linkages that they were trying to make. It was very transparent in a way that today is not, because things are within a business framework and things are patented and no one wants to reveal what's there. And I think that is, as you say, a large part of the problem, that not knowing who to trust, not knowing who is there building this machine that really has a lion's share to say about the course of our lives.
Amazing. So it looked like, Pavani, you might have had something to add?
we're all excited about this topic.
Yes, so with that said, let's just kind of dive into the particulars, and please let us know if you'd like to cycle through some more of the prepared content. But I guess what I'm curious about, maybe perhaps the audience as well, is, maybe some striking examples of this. So there was some mention, of course, of parole, and then, the sort of nefarious roots of AI, from 50 years ago. How are we seeing it, in addition to perhaps the AI that's enacting, let's say, in stock exchanges for us? What are some stark or startling examples that you guys have come across that really, have sort of lit a fire under you? So at Sparks, we call it, the moral imperative, where morality fits into modernized problem solving. Are there specific examples that you've seen in, let's say, the recent year where, it's incumbent for us to start tackling this?
So I'll give one example, and I'm going to move away from America for a second here. I'm going to go to China. There's something extraordinary going on there right now. They've been working on this for a number of years. They have a system called the social credit score, and they hope to have this fully implemented by 2020. So how good of a corporate, or I'm sorry, not a corporate citizen, how good of a citizen are you? Do you have the right friends? Are you employed the right way? What do people think about you? And your social credit score, if it gets too low, you can't buy a plane ticket or a train ticket. You can't travel, right? Because you're not a good citizen anymore. This almost seems, I don't know if anybody watches Black Mirror, but I think they just read what the Chinese government was doing and they just made it into that. It's almost unbelievable that a country is doing this right now. Now, I'm not saying we're anywhere near that, but if it can happen there, and if it can be enacted in that way, you can kind of see the dark side of where this could go.
Awesome. Anyone else?
Well, so there are a couple. I know in healthcare, people are very hopeful that AI can be that neutralizer, and this is kind of what we're seeing in all these industries, that AI is supposedly not biased and can help with diagnosing patients, with a more equal stance. And actually, the opposite is very possible as well, where, again, if the data sets aren't representative of anyone beyond, let's say, a white male, then you have entire groups of people who are going to be misdiagnosed or like completely just don't even know what to do with you because the algorithm can't process what's happening with you. And so that's kind of the same story that we're seeing across different verticals. This is probably less startling, and again, I'm really interested in those like really subtle things that we interact with every day that have implications. And so if you think about Instagram or these photo apps that we use, if you are a person of color, the way that these filters treat your skin is very obviously different than if you are not a person of color. And it might be one of those subtle things that it may be only if you are a person of color, you'll notice, or if you use Instagram. And maybe there isn't a lot of outrage about something like that. But if you go back into history, and this is where I appreciate your view as a historian, and look at the standards set by Kodak back in the, I think, 50s or 60s, where the reference card that they were using was called Shirley, who was a white model who would wear high contrast clothing, and she kind of set the standard for processing film. And so you ended up with film that was not treating darker skin tones in the way that it should have been. And it wasn't really until the chocolate industry and furniture industry started complaining about how they couldn't take pictures of chocolate and brown furniture that Kodak started to change their technology. And so, the history, and that's not artificial intelligence, but it's technology. And if there's a deep history of this already happening, and now you take companies like Instagram who are looking at, creating a product that is at least very initially, it was all about making you look like those vintage images. And you're kind of setting the clock back all of a sudden and now perpetrating, consciously or unconsciously, I do believe it's unconsciously, a culture where people are celebrating, or literally these images are whitewashing you if you're a person of color. And you're celebrating and correlating beauty or desirability with white. And so it's really interesting to me how these can happen like in these undertones. And we're talking about something like Instagram, which is giant. We're all using it, and it's shaping culture. And it's, not one of those blaringly, outraging examples, but it's, just one of many of these things that we're living with every day.
Absolutely, and thank you for highlighting that, Pavani, because I think that's where we can really appreciate where inclusion comes into play. I think we've seen that so much, let's say, in Hollywood, where people have really been calling, or even advertising, our own industry, calling for more people of different backgrounds to be in the mix, making the sausage so it's reflective of everyone. And, I think, therefore, it's so fascinating that we can appreciate all of the brokenness within AI, but we're still so reliant on it. So something that actually came out as a study in the summer, it's by Oracle and Future, they found that 93% of average working people are willing to take and trust directives from a robot, artificial intelligence, as we speak. So this is the year 2018. It's still very nascent technology. What do you think is the draw ultimately that makes us want to rely on algorithms, data sets that can then be implemented at scale and left to their own devices, as you mentioned with the black box? What is the appeal specifically for large industries? Why are we so compelled when it's still so new?
So I think there's two parts to what you brought up. There's the large industry part, and then there's also sort of the human part, right? I think the thing to remember is that as human beings, we want to avoid risk. We want to avoid making mistakes. We want efficiency. We want the easy way to go, right? So I don't have to remember a phone number anymore. I just pick up my phone and I look up whoever it is I'm looking for. I look at their name and I hit the tap. I haven't had to remember a phone number in a decade, right? And so everything we're building right now is around efficiency, right? And because it allows us to do more things and forces us to do less in terms of actual effort, right? And so I think AI is a tool that's built for efficiency. At its core is to speed up processing, the ability to do, as you said before, complex things quicker and better, right? And therein lies the better part. The better part is sort of the valuation part, is where value comes in terms of how are we saying what is good, right? And who's saying what is good? And how are we setting those standards? Because the bias comes in within those questions you set from the very beginning. And it comes from the coding of the system from the very beginning. And so for big business, for big industry, it's no different, right? Big businesses are looking for ways to grow their business, whether it's to cut the bottom or grow the top. Everything's about growth. It goes down to the bottom, goes down to the dollar, right? That's what's cared about. So the question becomes, how do you do that in a way that is also inclusive of value and values, right? Because corporations right now are stepping in, as we're seeing right now, government isn't exactly playing a values role in society these days, right? But big business is stepping in because there's a void to be played, and they realize there's money in that as well, too. And so within that, the question becomes, what are the values that we're applying to this, right? And because at the end of the day, it's all still about money, but can the values be a part of this play, right? And can values play a role within AI, right? And I think there's an appeal for that because, again, it makes money.
Absolutely. Any other perspectives to add on to that? The compelling piece or the driver of us, let's say, diving both feet into AI when it still can be quite problematic and has those problematic roots.
Go ahead. I was just going to chime in to say, it is, of course, about the efficiencies and so forth, but I think what I take away from that is that's a big business, a very scale that gets to say, all right, what is the problem, right? So framing the problem for which the efficiency is sort of the need. And so most of the rest of us aren't sort of there to sort of feed into or give input into that question. And I think that's where some of that imbalance begins to take shape, right? It's industry's priorities or framing of the problem or government's framing of the problem, and rarely individuals of us saying, here's what we need and want, why don't you go build that? Right.
I think and you mentioned this earlier, diversity and inclusion plays a factor into that, right? So we have yet to know what the world would look like if 50% of our corporations and government were led by women, for example, right? Or if there was representation across big business all the way up to the top, as well as in government all the way up to the top, if the representation looked like what the general population looks like. And so we have no idea what those problems and questions and business drivers would be, because we have yet to go there. And so that's where, I'm hopeful that we're headed towards that path, but it's kind of like this big unknown to me.
Absolutely. So it sounds like there's still data sets and models of our society that have yet to be explored, implemented, and then, actualized. So moving on, unless there's any continuing conversations, I'm curious to know what you guys see as the possibilities or way out for us. So we've talked about, again, the brokenness, the problematic aspects of AI, and especially where, let's say, inclusion and diversity are at stake. What do we see as a way for us to sort of dig out of this place we're in? How can we turn it around and make it something that can truly be not at cross purposes, but an accelerator of some of the great things we're trying to do?
So I'll take the technology view of this, right? Technology, through our entire history, the very first technologies we created, they were not good or bad. It was our decision of how we applied them, right? So fire kept us warm, we could cook fire, and then we could also burn down our neighbor's village with it, right? So technology has never been inherently good or evil. It's the same thing with artificial intelligence. So if we apply it, and we is the key word here, when I talked about Facebook being sued, they're being sued because people noticed, right? It depended on people who saw this was happening and got behind it and reached out to create change. I think all of us have a responsibility to be literate in what's happening and look for opportunities, because everyone does matter and everyone can make a difference. And with that said, I think pressure from all of us has corporations making some changes now. So IBM, the skin color issue, there's been big announcements from Microsoft and Google. IBM announced an AI ethics policy. MIT has something called the Turing box, where anybody can upload their AI code and it will look for biases in it. Google also announced that for TensorFlow. So the issue, people are becoming more aware of it, but the more people that are aware of it and the more people that take an action, you don't have to be a coder, you can be someone who just gets behind groups that are working to try to take some of this bias out. And I think the biggest thing, and someone said it earlier, is the solution to more diversity and inclusion is more diversity and inclusion, because then the whole system sees the future differently. So I think that's also the real point.
I think one way out too is the ability to stop and ask ourselves the question that just simply because a technology exists, does that mean we have to use it, right? And so case in point is when we talk about Microsoft and we talk about facial recognition that's being used in policing and crime sort of scenarios. Well, one response was, well, let's make this better. Let's make our facial recognition better, more inclusive, more diverse, so we can lock more people up easier. But few people say, well, maybe we should just not use facial recognition in this context, right? And so I think we've got to be able to stop and say, why are we using what we're using? Why are we doing what we're building? What are we getting out of it? What's the value, and who is it going to serve? And I think partly just stopping and asking ourselves some of those questions will at least give us room to think about consciously the kinds of choices that we're making going forward.
Yeah, you just said the word consciously, and again, unconscious bias is something that I've been studying a lot lately, specifically when we were talking about a path forward. If I could have the clicker, I have a few. Oh, I have the clicker. Of course, unconscious. I think this is kind of what you were talking about, right, Charlton? Like making sure we are asking ourselves these questions And too often what's happening is that people aren't stopping. Like, we live in this world where we're always on the go and there's so much happening, there's so much information, and we're rewarded for being very efficient and making decisions. Our conscious brain is working overload, so our unconscious kicks in and makes these decisions for us. And rarely do people stop and really consciously try to make decisions anymore. And so I think that's really important. And what we, within Sapient Razorfish, and this is true of not only our company, but every company within the industry and outside of the industry, diversity and inclusion has been an issue. We have not been able to really crack it. A lot of money is being poured into trainings and workshops, and specifically around unconscious bias, to make workplaces more inclusive and crack down on bias, specifically unconscious bias. But the research is starting to come out, and that even some of the big companies like Facebook and Google, these efforts are either not working or sometimes are also counterproductive. And so within our organization, what we started to ask ourselves, is there a way for us to maybe tackle it from a different angle, from a very human angle? We're pouring, again, money into training every year. And so our head of global head of diversity and inclusion reached out to our team, the Second Story team within the larger agency, and said, hey, you all are experienced design studios. You're doing really creative things for your clients every day. Like, pretend we were our own client. What would you design for our own people to go through an experience that would get at this? And so we piloted an experience in Atlanta that leverages technology and storytelling, which is kind of the core of what we do, and really tackled it from a really different angle. And so what we did was we interviewed hundreds of people within the organization, collected stories of where they were victims of bias within the workplace, curated and edited those stories down, altered the pitch of their voice so that you wouldn't be able to tell who it was. And then we sprinkled those stories all around the office in locations where they would have likely been experienced. And so this training is really not a training at all, it's an experience. And so what happens is participants are put these headphones on and they walk around their office follow a red line, and that red line takes them to multiple stories. And really all they're doing for about an hour is listening, which is something we rarely do, like really truly listen to each other. And so, for example, this man is listening to the story of a young mom talking about every day when she leaves at 5 p.m. to go pick up her kid from daycare, the subtle, nuanced bias that she experiences in the workplace. And this man's listening to the story of a coworker talking about, specifically a young African-American woman talking about the experience of literally meeting after meeting, feeling invisible, being interrupted chronically, or literally not being addressed. And as we were collecting these stories, these are not just one-off stories. These themes started to emerge, and they are chronic issues, but they are our own issues. And so we were able to kind of look inward and lay it all out there. And what we've noted is that this technique has been so incredibly successful. So people who were either completely oblivious or even resistant, I mean, how many of us want to actually attend a training that says it's going to fix all these problems, right? People go through this experience actually coming out of it wanting to do something about it because it's an emotional approach versus just a rational one. And I think that there's a need for both, to have that kind of rational, what is the bottom line? How is that going to help business to have diversity and inclusion? But there is also we're all human. You can't help but feel for someone when it's your colleague who's experiencing this day after day after day, and you leave that session wanting to change something. And so people end up pledging to one micro action that will counter a microaggression, and committing to it. And we have piloted this within Atlanta, and then since it has scaled across to all our major offices in North America, to Europe, and just 2 weeks ago to India. So this is within Sapient Razorfish, but our hopes are to scale it across Publicis Group, which would be 80,000 people. And so when I think about look, I have a very optimistic view because we've been talking about skepticism as well as pessimism maybe. For me, where the optimism comes from is seeing some of these people go through and have like their own mini transformation, and imagine 80,000 people doing work thereafter after having gone through this experience, approaching everything that they're designing and building in a different way. And I've seen this happen within our teams, the people that I work closely with every day, asking questions they wouldn't have asked before, like a young developer coming up to me and saying, hey, this, we're building this magic mirror experience that's going to go into a retail store, and it's supposed to recognize gestures of people as you're in front of it. And I don't think this thing is going to recognize, shorter people, specifically women, because he and his colleague were both men, are training it. And so getting a bunch of, and he's like, basically told me, he was like, we need to get a bunch of different people, all different structures, different body shapes to train this thing so that it'll work with more people. And those are conversations that I don't think we would have been having with, everyone if they hadn't gone through and been educated about bias and specifically unconscious bias. And so that's where, for me, the optimism comes from is, there's a technology approach to this, and then there's also this very human, like we just need to all look inward and educate ourselves and get better. The people who are making these things are biased, and that's why our creations are biased. So how do we, change that?
Absolutely, and that's a very poignant point. As the creators who are prone to error, it's only, of course, understandable that we would seed that into some of our greatest creations. So that brings me to the question, just to sort of transition us a little bit, culpability, the onus, ownership. A lot of these people who end up, designing, developing a lot of the AI that at least rises to prominence, they're of a very typical prototype or archetype, you could say. So who falls on their sword? If you're one particular type of person from a certain place at a certain time and you're designing, is it the fault of the initial coder? Is it the QA? Is it the company itself? Who ultimately is culpable for churning out what may ultimately be, detrimental things at scale? Because I think that's the most terrifying thing of all of this. When you have a system that is broken, but when it's truly systemic, then it becomes really hard to address that as opposed to maybe an instance of one-on-one bias. So where do you guys draw the line, and how do you think we can approach accountability and then, of course, course correction?
Yeah, again, because I think, as Pavani said, there's this human side, which is the path forward, right? We all have to change and we have to become more aware. But on the scalable side, using AI, how are we going to have people that are responsible? And I think we're seeing it in small ways, the examples I gave with Google and IBM, but that's not going to be enough. I almost liken it to, I've heard some of the panels today about data, and there's been all the changes about everyone's privacy and how data is captured, how your private data is used. And obviously in Europe, it's much more strict than here in the United States. I would imagine we should see a similar thing with this machine learning, these machine intelligence systems. So anytime that you engage with these systems, it should be explicit what it's doing, how it's doing. Maybe it even gets certified, right? That it cleared the non-bias certification from the MIT Turing box. I think we'll almost see like a better business bureau sort of seal of approval when a machine system has been shown to be as unbiased as possible. I think that'll be a topic at Advertising Week and probably maybe even starting next year. I wouldn't be surprised.
That's a very provocative claim. Joe,
Yeah.
you had something?
I'd say yes, and I'm going to liken this a little bit, whether it's AI or any technology, to that Pepsi ad, right? And I think we all know which Pepsi ad, right? There were people involved in every step of the creation of that Pepsi ad. There might have been a good intention from the very beginning of the creation of that Pepsi ad, and yet somewhere along the way, the decision making broke down. Somewhere along the way, people with the right perspective weren't invited into the room or weren't given a voice to speak up, right? And so when you're creating anything that you put out into the world at scale, right, it's touched by a lot of people along the way. And so it's that ability to have that voice, whoever's voice, speak up and address the issue and call it out and not allow for the emperor's clothes to take precedence in the room, right? Because people couldn't have not known what was coming up when they made that thing along the way, and yet there was decision making that was made that allowed it to go into the world, right? Or decisions that weren't made that allowed it to go into the world. And I think AI is the exact same thing. Technology is the exact same thing. At a certain point, when you have the diversity in the room and you empower the diversity to actually speak up and have a voice, then things like that don't happen. And ultimately, that's what it is. And I think most everything comes from good intentions. I tend to be an optimist in that way. I tend to believe in humanity and that most everything germinates from a good intention. It's just decisions that are made along the way that steer it errantly, I would say.
And I would say, that's the key point where Pavani's work really is optimistic, right? About people in positions of power or authority in the organization being able to say, look, what's happening here, maybe we should think about this, or a course correction. And so my skepticism in that sort of scenario comes in at the higher level of decision making. That is, the person or persons who are able to say, stop, right? Stop after I've made hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars of investment. Stop after I know this is really going to hurt my bottom line. And whether we really have the will and the courage with AI or any kind of technology to do that. And so I think that's where my sort of skepticism lies, and sort of wonder where we have to get to in sort of business contexts and organizations to really stem that and really influence at that level of power.
I would want to say one thing related to that from an optimistic standpoint. There's been multiple studies done. I think Anderson did the last one, that companies with a more diverse employee base are better on multiple metrics, including profitability. So we will be better and stronger and even more profitable if we can build more diverse organizations, both corporate organizations, government organizations across the board. But I guess the question just is, how do we get there?
And by the way, it's proven not only just within organizations, but within board levels as well too, right? Yeah. That higher performing boards are boards that are more diverse, right? And therefore drive greater revenue, right? And I think that's the key, is that it has to exist top to bottom, right? And even, the state of California just passed a law that every publicly traded company, I believe, has to have a female board member, right? That is a nice step. That is a step, right, towards more inclusion, and we can go further, right, as we know. And so, and because I think at the end of the day, I hate to keep harping on that, but it's true that money drives the system, right? Money drives change. The more that you can prove that, whether it's AI or technology or anything that we're talking about, the more that you can prove that diversity and inclusion is better for profit, better for society, better for everything across the board, well, then you're going to have less resistance to the system, right?
Amazing, beautifully said. And, just to kind of leave us off, because we delved into some of the pretty, heavy aspects and what's really at stake when we consider AI. But I think, there's some great learnings that AI as a concept, as, an emerging technology can take from us. So Pavani, you laid out a really amazing framework for how you and your company are tangibly actioning on that. I'd love to hear from just each of you briefly about certain action items that you're taking, and I'll start. So for instance, at Sparks and Honey, we believe that a great part of combating bias and, the disinclination towards inclusivity sometimes is to bring bias in, so of all types. So whether it's with some of our data sets or even some of what we call living segmentation, so these bots that we create to inhabit personas that may not be in our organization. In the Northeast, lots of people are liberal leaning, so we have bots that are reflective of sometimes more conservative viewpoints to break our own bias, for instance, and bring in perspectives that are not typically given voice, as well as inviting the outside in, people bringing their viewpoints to the discussion. So that's one of the ways that, if AI were a person, we'd say, watch us work and see how you can implement that for yourself. What about you guys? What are certain things that you're doing in the here and now that might be fodder for scalable ways for us to begin undoing some of the harm AI has already started?
Yeah, so one example that I'm excited about, also my company ladders up to Publicis, the global holding company, and diversity and inclusion has been a driving force at the organization for a while now. So we have an event in actually 10 days where 100, it's the multicultural talent pipeline. So these will be graduating students, minorities, that will be coming actually to our offices in Atlanta. I'll be presenting about the future, but this is specifically the organization trying to bring in a diverse new workforce and help change the perspective. So for all of my talk about technology, I think you really do have to start with the people.
Yeah, and I'll start right there because as not a corporate person or in a business, but in a higher education institution, much of my work these days is really about educating and helping to build capacity amongst students that run through undergraduate students, graduate students, to ask these questions and be part of that pipeline, right? So that's real. If diversity is truly an answer to some of the challenges with AI, then that starts very early in terms of building a pipeline, something that we all have encountered in our varying workplaces. That really means volume, right? So if we're going to have people not just sort of represented fully in that diversity in our organizations, but at every level, think about the time and investment that takes, and think about the time in which it takes to innovate these new technologies. And so part of my skepticism is that we may be already behind, but hopefully we're working to kind of fill that pipeline.
Awesome. And so I think that's all we have time for at this moment. Lots of great food for thought amongst all of us. If time permits, do we have any for a Q&A?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. We'll make it work.
Yeah.
Right up front.
Hi, excellent panel. I think it's fantastic what you guys are talking about. It's right on point. My concern, I deal with middle school age children, Y and Z. And their acclimation to society is a little bit different in that it's more of lifestyle. It's not so much gender and anything else now. It's very interesting. But I'm watching how certain skill sets are being eluded because of AI. My children don't do script anymore. My children don't sit there and tabulate anymore. And I'm very concerned about the mental capacity. And I would love to hear anybody that's thinking about that, because what I'm finding from AI and all the research that I'm doing, it's mostly adhering to the adult life. It's not necessarily going generations ahead and what that ramification is going to do. And honestly, as an educator, I feel like it's dumbing our children down. I did a test the other day in the after-school program for them to open up a dictionary and find the words. Oh, my God. It was awful. And it was heartbreaking because it was the alphabet. And it was being able to go forward and backwards, which was a skill set that you could do like this. These kids could not do it.
So
Just a minute for the answer.
awesome. Well, we've got someone in higher ed right here. I think you're best equipped to maybe offer up some insight.
I mean, I'm just going to sort of agree with you, right? And to make the point that much of this question does really begin way back, right? And so the question is, are we going to really invest in those earlier generations, thinking very far ahead about the problems and challenges that are in front of us?
I'm going to slightly disagree. And not that those things aren't valuable, and that's not at all what I'm saying. I would conjecture that the skill sets that your kids are learning now are different from the skill sets that we learned at those same age groups, right? At those same stages. I think with every generation, new technologies come in, and the paradigms of what we grew up with or our parents' generation grew up with change from generation to generation. So the skill sets, they may not know how to use a dictionary, right? My kids, when do you ever use a microfiche anymore, right? Those are all technologies that exist at the time. I think right now they're learning new skill sets, new technologies, new ways of learning that are just different from the way we grew up, right? So the question is, are they worse off for that? That's a whole other question altogether. And it's hard for any of us to assess until we get through time, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we have to end it here. So thank you for coming.
Thanks for nerding out with us.
Thanks for having us.